Hello and welcome to the third big real-world project in this course. And so this one is of course about CSS grids. So without further ado, let me show it to you. So here it is. This is the project that we're going to code in this section. So this is the landing page of a fictional company called Nexter, which sells luxury homes across the world. And so their slogan is "Your own home, the ultimate personal freedom." Okay? So once again, I designed and built this project specifically just for this course. And the goal of this project is basically to use as many grids here as possible. Okay, so there are not like these fancy effects going on like we had in the other project, but instead I really focused on a CSS grid here. And so the entire layout of the page is of course with CSS grid. And then I also used grids in many smaller components. Like for example here on this side here we have a CSS grid. Then this entire header here works as a grid. For example, these elements here are also laid out in a grid. Of course, when you come down here, you see that this is also a grid here. And these images are also laid out as a grid. And so you see that all of these components here are really designed so that we can use grids in many different situations, so that we can apply all of these properties that I showed you in the last section in real world scenarios. Okay. So this beautiful card here is also entirely coded up in grid. And so you will see how easy it is actually to build it with grids. So you will see how little CSS we actually have to write. Okay. Then down here, of course, you see this is yet another grid. And this time with a typical application, which is like an image gallery like you have here. And then just a small footer. Okay. And of course, this entire thing is completely responsive as well. So let's check that out. Okay. So let's make it a bit smaller maybe. Okay. So you see this is the page. And then of course it's completely responsive as well. So for example at this width here, you see that this changes like from this 3 column to these 2 columns here. Okay. And down here also everything changes. And here now you have 2 columns as well. And yeah, you see that also the sidebar moved up here to the top. And when we reduce this even further, then of course we have this 1 column layout basically with everything in a mobile view. Okay, so I hope that you're excited about this project. I really tried to make it beautiful again, just like the other projects, so that you feel great about yourself once you finished it, and show potential clients that you built this here with the new CSS grid technology. Okay, and so I hope that you already downloaded the starter files to start with this project from the GitHub repository that I included in the beginning of the course. So I already have the starter files here on the desktop. And I already have it opened here in VS Code. Okay, so let's very quickly go through the starter files that I have here. And this is actually very similar to the last Trello project. Okay, so we have a CSS folder, then we have the images, and we actually have a lot of images this time. Okay, then we have the SASS folder, and you notice that this time I already created the CSS files so that we don't have to create them one by one, and they are already here imported in this main file. And so I don't have to do all of this in the videos. And so you see that the architecture here is also slightly different than what we had in the last project. So I have now 1 file for each part of the website basically. But I'm going to go deeper into why I did it this way a bit later. What matters for now is that we're going to start with the base CSS file, where this time I also already have the color variables here and also some font variables. Okay. Then of course also the index file, where we have the Google fonts already included. This time it's called Josephine Sans and something called Nunito or something. Then of course the style is already included, the fav icon, the title is already here, and then the empty body element. Okay. And finally, also the package.json file, and this is again very similar to the last Trello project. So we have our watch CSS and dev server scripts here to basically start our development workflow, where at the same time we watch for SASS changes and we have our dev server. Then down here, this is like our build process, and I'm going to talk about that a bit later. All right. So up here we say Nexter and next web page as a description, and so everything is ready to work here. Now let's actually install these dev dependencies that we have here, because you see we have no node modules folder here on the left side. So we have to open up our terminal and do npm install here. So let me increase this a bit for you. So cd desktop and 3 Nextdoor. And you can of course navigate to wherever your project file is located on your file system. And now I'm going to run npm install. And remember that what this does is that basically it looks at our package.json file and then installs all of these dev dependencies that we have listed here in this file. And now you see that the folder is already here. And so let's now very quickly, just to test if everything works, let's start by creating like our global settings here in this base.scss file, okay? So we start very quickly with our global reset. So we see everything, including the pseudo elements, before and after. And as always, we set their margin to 0 and their padding to 0. And we also say box sizing inherit. And we're then going to inherit that from the HTML. Okay, and so this is where we have box sizing set to border box. And I already explained you why we did it this way in the last project, right? Now another thing that we do here in the HTML always is to set our overall font size. And so we're going to go with the same technique that I showed you before. So we're going to set it to 62.5%. And that's so that 1 rem equals exactly 10 pixels. Okay, so let me actually write it down here for you once again. So 10 pixels divided by 16 pixels, which is the browser default, makes 62.5%. And so this way, 1 rem equals 10 pixels. Okay, and now just the global like font settings on the body element. And so we set the font family, and actually I already have a variable here. So we set it to font primary. And the primary font is then this Nonito font here, okay? Then the color that I chose should be this color gray dark here. So color gray dark. So it's this one here. So again, we have our primary color, of course, which is this like this gold color. So I chose gold color for this brand because it's luxury homes, as I was telling you in the beginning. And so therefore gold seemed to be a good color choice for that, okay? Then the secondary color is like this very dark blue, which plays very well with gold. And so that's why I chose that. And then we have, of course, the lighter grays as always and the darker grays. And they're like a bit also like brown. And that's because that complements the gray primary color in a bit better than if we would just have used a pure black-based gray. So you see here on the color thing here that this is close to the gray sides, but also in a bit in the golden part of the color spectrum. So let's then actually use that. Color gray dark 2. Okay, the font weight that we want is 300, and I can use 300 because that's what I included here from the Google font. Okay, so I have Nonito and I have font weights of 300 and 300 in italic. And the same here for the Josephine Sans, which will be more for titles. Okay, so I chose the Nonito font as the overall font family because it's a bit more neutral. And then this Josephine Sans we have in weights 300, 400, and 400 italic. And this one will be for the titles. So this time we have 2 fonts. Okay, so font weight of 300. And so it's kind of a thinner font, and that gives it once again a bit more a luxury feel to the entire page. And that's what we're looking for in a design like this. Finally, the line height should be 1.6. And now let's just add some dummy text here, just so that we can test if our development workflow is actually working properly. So let's check out the terminal actually here. And yeah, it looks like everything worked just fine. And so now we can do npm run start. But before we do that, actually, let's come back to the package.json file, and we can do one small change here in the live server. And that is to set the browser. Because if we just run it like this, then it will basically launch our default browser for the dev server. And so it will launch Google Chrome. But remember that because of the CSS Grid dev tools that we want to make use of, we have been using Firefox in this part of the course. And so we're going to do that in this project as well. And so what we can do here is to specify the browser option. So we write browser and then Firefox. And so it will automatically open up in Firefox instead of Google Chrome. Okay. So npm run start. And actually for the start script, I'm not sure if I have told you this in another lecture, but for the start command, we actually don't even need to type run, okay? So for start, we just need to type npm start. And now let's see. And yeah, here we go. So test text. However, it doesn't really look like our SASS styles is already applying here. And I'm sure that's because we still have to save the file. So remember that here, this SASS script that we're running here. So this one here, the watch SASS task, which is the one that we're running, is waiting for changes. And so it's only going to compile the SASS file when we save it. Okay, so let's give this one a save. I didn't even change anything, but I just saved it. Okay, and so let's check it out here. And yeah, it's changed something. And so let's go to Firefox. And so now you see it changed. Let's actually get it back to 100% here. And so now you see here that this is the lighter gray text and already with the font family that I specified. And so just as before, we have the final version here on this side so that we can take a look at what we want to build. And then here, of course, our development version. And so right now we're ready to start with the project. And so yeah, that's what we're going to do in the next lecture, where we're going to start building the overall layout of this page. So I hope you're excited for that. And so come join me in the next video. In this lecture, we are going to be building the overall layout of our website. And so in this lecture, you're going to learn how to build a complex and modern layout using advanced CSS grid techniques. And so what this means is that you now will actually apply the concepts that you learned in the last section to a real-world project. And you're going to learn how to choose different row and column track sizes for different types of content in a real-world context. So this is actually going to be a rather complex lecture, and so let's get started. And we start by analyzing the overall layout that we want to build. So the first thing that you notice right away is this sidebar here on the left side, which goes all the way from the top of the page to the beginning, so all the way until down there. So that is the first part of the layout. Then we have this part here, which is the header, and then here on the right side, the top 3 realtors that work for the Nexter company, okay? So this is another part of the layout. Then down here, we have like these features here of the company. So basically describing how the company works. And so that is another part of the layout. Then coming down here, we have like this testimonial section here with this part on the left side and then this part on the right side. And so this basically is like a testimonial of some people who found their perfect home. And so I call this one here a story. And so this here is one part of the layout, which is like the gallery, like the pictures, and then this here is the content of the story on the right side. You see that they have this different background, of course, and so we can treat them as 2 parts of the layout. Then down here we have the next section of the page, and that's these homes. So different homes that we can buy at this company. Then next up we have this section here, which is a typical application of grid, which is this gallery, and then finally the footer. All right. So we have a total of 8 parts in our layout. So the first one here, the sidebar, then with the footer 2, 3, 4, and then we can treat this here as 1. So 5, 6, 7, and then here on the side, number 8. So let's now go to a markup and put all of them in there. Okay, so this is our HTML, and you see that I already put the container class here on the body tag. And so that is going to be our grid container. And all of these parts of the layout that we just saw are then the grid items, which we're then going to place on the grid. So let's start with the sidebar. So we're using a div for that. And for now, I'm just going to put the name of each part, so of each module, let's say, in here. So the sidebar, then the header, and let's use the header HTML5 element with the class header. And of course, we write header in here. Then we have a div with the realtors. Okay, so top 3 realtors. Then we have the features section. So let me actually call this a section. So section features. All right. And then next up, we have the story. Remember? So let me show that to you again. So the story is basically these two things. Now, in order for these to be grid items, each of these sides has to be a different element, right? And so we say that these two are part of a story, but this left side here is the pictures, and this right side here is the content. And so each of these will be a different grid item, okay? And so let's use a div for that, and then story. So that is like the block, and then we use the element pictures. Okay, and it's perfectly legal to do it like this, so it's no problem having the block and the element without having a parent block. So we know that these two are part of the story block, but there's not really an element for that because we want both of these elements to be grid items. Okay, does that make sense? So we have the story pictures and the story content. So story content and story pictures. Next up, we have then the section with the homes. Then we have the gallery. So section gallery. And then finally the footer. Okay, and so that's our markup structure. Let's take a look at that if it's already in our HTML or in our page actually. And so yeah, so here we go. That is the content of our page for now. Let's now go ahead and actually give each of them here a background color so that we can better see what's actually going on here, okay? So remember that we already have a file for each of them here in the SASS folder. And so let's open up each of them one by one. Okay, so sidebar, background color, and I'm actually going to use the primary color for this one because that will be the final color actually. So color primary, let's take a look if that works already. And yeah, so this our primary color. Next up, we have the header. And so let's use another color here from our variables here. So let's use this gray color, right? So we're going to change most of this later, but this is just so we can see what's going on. So next is the realtors, and so realtors, background color, and here I actually use the definitive color. So this is color secondary, and it is this dark blue, right? So let's see, and it's actually not really there. So this is here the dark blue color that I mean, okay? So let's see what's going on here. Yeah, it's just a small typo over here. So let's save and close. Now it should be there, and of course it is. So now the features, and let's use, for example, this color here as the background color in here. So features, save it and close it. Next up, we have the story. So the story is the name of the block, remember that, but we actually don't even have an element called story. But what we do have is an element called story pictures and one called story content, right? And so we're going to build these selectors like we've been doing throughout all the other projects in the course. So using this SASS way. So the and then underscore underscore pictures, and this of course will translate into story pictures. So let's use color primary here again. And again, this doesn't really matter at this point. It's just so that we can see the boxes a bit better. Okay, now in this case, let's actually use the real color, which will be this one here. So this light gray, close it, let's check it out, and yeah. So you see that all of these colors are here. And so now next up is the homes. So homes. So let's use the blue color again. and actually the same for the footer. So let's just copy this code here for the footer, because that's actually also the definitive final color. And then for the gallery, the background color, let's again use this one. Give it a save and close. And this one we can close as well. And so let's check it out. And so yeah, each of them now has their own background color. Okay, and so let's now actually start with the grid part of building this layout. So that's the most exciting part, right? So remember that this element here had this container class. So this body element. And this body element is what actually will be our overall grid container, right? And so I gave it the class container so that we can now style it. I could have done it directly in the body here, of course, but I think it's a bit more cleaner to actually use this container class. So it is a grid container, and so we start by saying display grid. So nothing new here at this point. And so let's now start with the rows. So grid, template rows. And so let's take a look now at our final design again. So let's check out how many rows we actually want. So the first row is this one here, right? And let me show you that the height of this row here is actually a percentage of the viewport height, okay? So if I decrease this here, then you will see that the height of the container adapts as well, right? And so the size of this row here is in viewport height units. So let's actually go over there and define that already. So the first row check should have a height of 80 viewport heights. Okay, so right now we have an explicit grid with only one row, right? And all the other items that will be added in the implicit grid. So the items that don't have any space here in this 1x1 grid. Okay, so right now we only defined one row. So let's take a look at that. And yeah, so that's the first one. Right now it says here that it's the sidebar, but of course we're going to change that in a second. What matters here is that the first row now has this 80 viewport. And let's actually decrease that, and so you can see that it's actually working. Actually, let's go back here and take a look at the second row. So the second row is this one here, so all of this. And so this one will contain this part of the features. Now, how do we want this row here to be sized? Well, actually, we simply want it to contain here this content. And if we increase this content, we of course want this row here to grow with it. So let's say that the content grows like this, and that it's a bit larger now. And so of course we want the row to grow with it, right? So how do we do that? Well, we actually already did it in one of the intro lectures. And so what we can say here is that we want this to have the min content. Okay, now we could also put auto here, like this, and auto is actually the default if you do not specify anything. So auto basically also means that it adapts to the content, okay? And in this case, it really is the same. So we can write main content or auto here. It really doesn't matter, because either way, it's gonna mean that there will be enough space to fit all the content, okay? So main content, and that's not going to change anything here. So it just looks the same, because right now the content is just this text in the second row, okay? So let's go over to the third row. And this row here is actually not a function of the viewport height, but the viewport width. So let me show that to you again. And you see that as we decrease the viewport width, the size of these boxes here decrease. So of this row here is increasing and decreasing, and so basically adapting here to the viewport. And so that means that we're using the viewport width unit. So let's actually do that. And what I did here is to use 40% of the viewport width. And so by now you're seeing how important it is to really think about responsiveness. So right from the beginning of defining our grid tracks and columns as well. So you see that in this real world scenario, we're not just using pixels here, but instead we're using real units that make sense for the content that we're putting in here. And so units like viewport height or viewport width are really important units to use in a real world scenario like this one here. So in the grid examples that you see online, or even that we did in the last section, we always used like some fixed size for the columns and for the rows, right? But in here, we don't always do that. So we use units like this, And we also simply want the rows to adapt to the content, especially in the rows. Not so much in the columns, but in the rows, it's sometimes really useful to simply let them have the height of the content. Okay, and actually the next one will be exactly that. So the fourth row is this one here, and it's similar to the futures row in that we simply wanted to have the height of its content. Okay, and so let's use main content again. And the same thing actually for this one here. Okay, so this one should also simply be the height of all of these images here together. And then the same thing also for the footer. So we're not going to define any static value for any of this. And so all we have to do now is to say main content again. And actually, instead of that, let's do repeat. Okay, because we want it 3 times now. And so instead of writing it out 3 times, let's simply use the repeat function, okay? So I hope that makes sense. And if it doesn't, then just try to imagine that we put fixed pixel values here in all of these rows. So imagine this would be a hard-coded 1000 pixels, and here as well, and here like, let's say 800 pixels, something like that. And imagine what would happen if we then started to resize our window. So if a user viewed the page from a phone or from a tablet. We could of course use media queries to adapt in that situation, but it's far easier to think responsive right from the beginning and size the rows and the columns in a responsive and flexible way right from the start. Okay? So always think about that when you're designing and building content with CSS grids. So we have the rows now, and the next thing we have to do is to define our column tracks. But actually, I'm going to leave that to the next lecture because that's even more complex, and actually a lot more complex than defining our row tracks. Okay, so I'm going to leave that to the next lecture, as well as the placement of all our grid items in the correct position, so that it in the end looks like the layout that we're going to build. Let's now define the column tracks of our layout and then place the grid items in it, so that we end up with our final design. So let's now think about the column tracks of this design. So it's very common in web design to use a design grid with like 8 or 12 or 16 predefined columns. And so that's also what we're going to do in here. Now it may not really be necessary for this design, but as I mentioned, grid systems like this one are widely used in web design. So for example, Bootstrap has a 12 column grid, and many other design systems out there work the exact same way. And so that's why I wanted to teach you here how we can use that as well. So we start with an 8 column grid here, so something very simple, and then I'm going to keep adding some stuff, but we're going to build it step by step so it makes all the sense to you. So let's start with the 8 column layout. Imagine that we wanted just a very, very simple 8 column layout. All we had to do is to say grid template columns and then repeat 8 and 1 FR, right? So this would produce 8 equally sized columns occupying the entire viewport. And that's exactly what it would look like. Okay? So the first row here, remember, has 80% of the viewport height. And so our 9 grid items would fill these 8 columns in here and then add another item down here in the second row. But that's not quite what we want, because what we want is actually to have like this fixed here in the middle of the viewport, right? So we want, like, for example, in here, we want this here to have always the same width, this entire part, right? So we have this here and then centered nicely in the viewport, like we're used to having it. And so what that means is that these columns in the middle, they have actually a fixed width. And let me actually show you the grid inspector here, so that makes it a bit easier to understand. Okay, and you see that these are the 8 columns that I was talking about. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, right? So these are our main 8 columns. So we want them to have a fixed width, right? So let's do that. And remember that usually we use something like 1140 pixels or 1200. So something between 1100 and 1200 I think would be reasonable. And so let's divide 140 by 8. That is approximately 142 pixels. So let's simply say that it's 140 pixels and make it 14 rem. right? Because remember, 14 rem translates to 140 pixels. So let's take a look at that now. And so that's what it looks like. But now suppose that we decrease our viewport. Then it doesn't even adapt at all. And that makes total sense because this is just a fixed width columns. And so I already showed you in the last section how we can fix that. Okay? And so what we're going to use here is the min-max function. So we say that the maximum should be 14 rem, but it can be lower, but never below the min content. Okay? So the minimum size that it should have in order to fit the content in there. So let's think about it again. So we want to have 8 columns, and we want the width of each of these columns to be between their minimum content and 140 pixels. Okay? So let's take a look at that now. And here we go. So now it actually is starting to adapt to the viewport width. Okay? But also it never grows larger than these 140 pixels for each of the column. Okay? So that's kind of what we want already. Also, we want something else, and that's this sidebar here. So you see that we have these 8 columns here in the middle, but then on the left side we have the sidebar. And so that's also a column track. Okay? So let's add that here as well. And we want this to be 80 pixels wide. So 8 rem. And so just like that, we added another column. So right now we have 8 rem for the sidebar, and then our 14 rem columns beside that. So let's take a look at that again. And so here you have the sidebar. And so now the last step is to actually basically center these 8 columns between this end of the viewport and this sidebar, okay? Because we don't actually want this to be centered in the viewport, but let's say between the sidebar and the end of the page. And so how can we do that? What do you think would be the best way to achieve exactly that? Well, we could simply add 2 more columns, one to each side of these 8 columns here in the middle. So one here on the left side, so let's say here, and then one here on the right side. And we want both of them to occupy the remaining of the space. Okay, does that make sense? And so what I just said translate into 1 fractional unit in here and 1 fractional unit at the end. So I hope that makes sense as well. So let's check it out. And here we go. So let's actually use our grid tool here as well. And so here we go. Let's see it down here as well. And so this is what I was saying. So we have our 8 grids here in the middle, the 8 columns actually. And then here on the right side and on the left side, we have the one that occupy the remaining space. So if we now decrease this viewport, you will see that these ones are the ones that start to shrink first, right? So this last one and this one here. So they started to shrink because they are the one that occupy the fractional space, so the remaining space. Okay? And so that is kind of what we wanted. Having our 8 columns centered right in the viewport. Now, if we hadn't this sidebar here, then we could have used the margin auto 0 trick, okay? So where the margin on the left and on the right side are set to auto, and then that would center the element or all of these items in the viewport. Or we could also have used, of course, the justify content property, but that wouldn't have been perfect in this case as well. And well, actually another reason why we want to do it like this is what I'm going to show you here. And that's these sections here that go from one side to the other. And so that's what I call the full bleed sections. So you see that in here, for example, here on the top, we have this here occupying only our 8 columns in the middle. But if you then move down here, you see that this full bleed section actually goes all the way from this side here to the right side of the viewport. And the same thing you can see here in the gallery and actually even in the footer. And also the header and in the top here. Okay, and so these are the full bleed sections, and we then need these columns here on the left side and on the right side to basically break out of our predefined 8 column grid that we have in the middle of the page, right? And so that's another thing that this layout here allows us to do perfectly. So this is perfect for having full bleed sections in the middle of some 8 column sections. And actually this is a trend that we've been seeing more and more in web design, which is having exactly that, what I just said. So having a couple of like design elements which are centered in the viewport like we have here with this 8 columns, but then sometimes we have some full bleed sections in the middle of that. And so grid layout is perfect for doing exactly that in a simple way. Okay, so the first time that we actually set this up is maybe not so simple, but I hope that you understood the logic behind of this. So again, we started with an 8 column layout that are these 8 columns here. Then on the left side, we added this sidebar, and then we added this column here on the left side and on the right side, which both occupy the remaining, so the fractional space, in order to center these 8 columns in the middle of the page. And if you then want a full bleed section, we can occupy these contents here and have a section that goes all the way from the left side to the right side, for example. And with that, we can kind of break the inner 8 column layout. So I hope that does a lot of sense to you. Now, in order to make our life a bit easier when we start placing the items, let's actually name these column tracks here. And so we already talked about that in the last section. And so I'm gonna name this one here the sidebar start and the sidebar end. And then remember that the grid line can have multiple names, and so this one will be also called the full start, because basically this is where we want to start the full bleed sections. So imagine that we have a full bleed section, like I explained before, then that would start right here after the sidebar, and it would go all the way until the end. So let me name the last grid line here as well. So full end. Now the grid line that comes after this one here, I'm going to call it the center start. Okay, because this is basically the beginning of our 8 columns, and so that's the part that's going to stay centered in the middle. And so this one is called the center, and so I'm going to call this one center start, and then the grid line after this, the center end. And now finally, we also want to name all of these columns. And so we can do that, and we did it before actually, and so we create a set of named lines. So we do it in the repeat here, and then this one is called, simply call start, and then after it is the call end. And remember that this is then going to create 8 call starts starting from number 1 to number 8. So we're going to have call start 1, 2, 3 all the way to 8, and the same thing for call end, right? Now before all of this starts confusing you, let's actually use this in practice right now. So let's start by placing the sidebar, okay? And so let's open it. And we want the sidebar to start from the grid line called sidebar start to sidebar end. So sidebar start and sidebar end. And then the second step is that we want it to span all the way from the beginning of the grid to the end in terms of rows, right? So grid row, we want it to start right at the beginning of our design. Remember? So let me show it to you again. So it starts right here and goes all the way until the end. Okay? And so what's like the keyword for the end? That's right, it's -1. So it starts at the beginning and goes to the end. And yeah, that's exactly what you see happening here. So right now we only have 2 row tracks. And so right now the sidebar is not as tall as it is in our example, but it will of course start increasing as we add more rows to the grid. So let's continue. And maybe you're wondering why we are not naming the rows. We're only naming the columns and not the rows. And that is because in an overall layout like this, the focus is always more on the columns and not so much on the rows. So sometimes you might not even want to size the rows here, because sometimes all you really want to do is that all your rows fit to your content. And in that case, you only really need to define the columns, because the columns are always more important. So let's now do the features part. Okay. So the features, remember, they go from this part here all the way to this part. So basically from the beginning to the end of our central 8 grids. Okay. And that's what we called the center here, right? So remember, that we called it center start, then we have the 8 columns, and then we have the grid line called center end. And so all we have to do is to use these names. So grid column, center start, all the way to center end. Okay, and here we go. So you see it starts here and then it ends down here. So exactly what we wanted to have. We also have the header and the top 3 realtors, but let's leave them for a bit later, because these are not as straightforward as the others. Okay, and so let's actually now continue with the gallery and the footer. So the gallery we see goes all the way from one end to the other end. And so remember what we called this? We called it the full, so the full bleed section. And so full start and full end. And so let's do that. So grid column starting at full start and ending at full end. And the same actually for the footer. So let's just copy this. And let's check it out. Moving down here, and here you go. So the gallery spans all the way from the sidebar here to the end, and as well as the footer. Let's actually increase here the font size of all of these items here at the same time. And so I'm just gonna use it like this. So I say that I want a container and then all the direct children. And this is just here for development purposes. So I'm gonna change that here in a second. So let's just give all of these a 40 pixels of padding and a font size of 3 rem. Okay, and again, I'm going to delete this later. This is just so we can see a bit better what's going on here. And so our rows are now a bit larger. So this is starting to look real good. Now, as for the homes, we actually want them to be the same as the features. So from start center to start end. So homes, grid column, starting from the grid line center start and go to center end. And exactly that's what happened. So just like the features, it is occupying our central 8 grid part here, right? Now, of course, we could have used here just the line numbers here and simply make this start from like line number 3, I think in this case. So 1 to 3 it would have been, and then say span, and then just add all of these numbers. So spanning from number 3 to line 11. But that would be highly impractical. And so it's really much easier to name our column lines like this. So we defined the homes, features, gallery, footer, and sidebar. Next up, let's think about the header and the realtors. So let's come here to our original design. And so you see that what I did here is to give 2 parts of our 8 columns to this realtors and 6 columns to the footer. Okay, so basically 6 out of 8 columns are for the header here, and 2 out of the 8 columns are for the realtors. And then of course we add this outer part here, so here and here, so that we end up with a full bleed look here. And so that is why these columns that we have here in the middle are so useful, because they allow us to build different kind of designs. For example, if you come down here, you see that we used this grid line here in the center to put one part of this design on the left side and the other part here on the right side of this central line. So in this case, it's 4 columns for this pictures part of the story and 4 columns for this content part of the stories. Okay, and so let's code that up as well. So the header grid column, it starts at full start, and that's not correct. So start, so full start is basically here right after the sidebar, and it ends after the 6th columns. Okay, so let's actually count this. So this is the first line of this set. So this is the column number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, right? And so this here is the end of column number 6. And so it translates into call end 6, right? So remember from the intro lectures that when we have a named set of grid lines, then we have to use the numbers. And in this case, it ends after the 6th column, okay? And now the realtors didn't start right after that. So grid column, so call start 7, all the way until full end. So let's check that out. And yeah, so that's exactly what we have here in our demo, right? So you see, it's exactly the same. So just to make sure that you understand why this works, let's remember that this here is the first column. So column start number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, right? And so it starts at the 7th column right here and goes all the way until the end, of course. And so now all that's left to do is to place the story pictures in story content, because right now they're not really where they are supposed to are. And so let's take a look at that again. And yeah, I already explained that before. So it goes all the way until the end of the 4th column, and then the next one, so the content, it starts at the beginning of the 5th column, okay? So let's do that. So grid column, full start, and it goes until call end 4. So that's exactly what I said before, right? And then this one goes from grid column, call start 5, so the 5th column until full end. And that should be it. So let's check that out. And yeah, it's correct. That's exactly what we were looking for. Awesome. So that's really great. So with this, we finished our overall layout actually. So great, that's fantastic. So it's really simple to create a complex layout like this. And I think this is really rather complex. So I tried to do something not all too weird, but at the same time to go into some complexity so that we don't just build another boring demo layout here, okay? So instead we went for a real world look here with this design. Now one last thing that I want to change here is something for this situation. So imagine that we start decreasing here, then of course our 8 columns here always stay nicely centered, right? And you can see this very well here in this blue homes part, right? So you see that it stays centered, of course, and that's exactly what we defined. But watch what happens as we really approach the width of these 8 columns. So you see that at some point here, this space on the left and on the right side almost disappears. And that's because this column here, so this column track and this column track, they are defined to be 1 FR, so 1 fraction of the remaining space. And so they do exactly what we told them to do. But we actually don't want it to be quite like that, because we usually always want to have some margin between the content and like the margin of the page. And in this case, this really starts to stick here to the sidebar. And so that's not ideal. And so what we can do is something very simple. So what do you think we can do here? Well, all we have to do here is to use the min-max function here. And so we say that we want this to be between 6 rem, so 60 pixel, and 1 fractional unit. Okay, and just like this, we will always keep a minimum of 60 pixel on this side. And of course, we want the same here on the other side, right? So what we did with this is to ensure that this column never gets smaller than 6 rem. And instead, what will start to shrink when there's not enough space to fit these 40 rem columns here in the viewport will be the columns themselves. So they are the ones who will start shrinking. So let's take a look at that. And so as we approach, you see, so we approach these 60 pixels here, and let's actually inspect that. Inspect that element. And actually we cannot inspect it really. Instead, let's do it like this. So here we see that this has 60 pixels, right? So 16 times 511. And so these 60 pixels is the 6 rem that we just defined. So that's the minimum that this column will always have no matter what. Okay? And so as we now decrease the viewport, the columns will start to shrink, right? And so what this does is that it basically ensures that there's always a margin between the content and the end of the page. And so with that, our layout is actually really completed. There's nothing more we have to add, and we are ready to now build all of these sections one by one. So I know that this was probably rather complex for a beginner like you, but that's why I built this layout here step by step, starting with just the 8 columns and then growing up from there, until we reached in the end this fully fledged design. So once more, I want you to really understand what happened here and to experiment with it in case you didn't. So it's really important that before moving forward, you are 100% sure you know what we did here, okay? So that this really makes sense to you. And if you have any question, then of course you can post it to the Q&A section on Udemy, and you will get then help there so that you can make sure that you understand 100% what's going on here, so that you can build your own layouts in your future. And they will not always be like this, okay? So sometimes it may be a bit simpler, and you just have to use then the tools that I gave you to build your own layouts. So you may not always have like a sidebar, or some of the things that I have here, they might not really apply to your own particular design. But as I said before, I wanted to have something more complex so that we can actually apply all of the contents that we learned before to this real world situation. But enough talking, let's move on to the next video and start building this web page. In this lecture, we are going to build the feature section of our website. And so what you're going to learn here is how and why to create grids inside of grids, how to create a responsive component without media queries, and again, you already know this last part, so we did that already in the intro section, but again, this time we're going to do it in a real world scenario. And then finally, we will build even a very small component using the power of CSS Grid. And so we're going to start with this part here of the website, so the feature section, as I was saying. Now I chose to go with this first because it's a lot more simple than this section here actually, so the header or the realtors. So this one here is easier, and so that's perfect to get started with this page, and we will then come back to this top part here and do it later, okay? So what we have here are basically 6 features laid out in a 2x3 grid. So 3 columns and 2 rows. And so this is of course a perfect use case for using CSS Grid. So let's again start doing that in our markup. Okay, and let's actually close all of these SASS files here and then start with our markup. So here in the features section. So let's again use Emmet in order to place 6 features here. So we're going to call each of these simply feature. And now let me show you something else with Emmet. So in the CodePen lectures, I already showed you that we can use this $sign here to number stuff. But we can also use Emmet to introduce some text into the HTML element right off the bat. So and for that, we just have to use the curly brackets. And so let's say that we want to number these features from 1 to 6. So in each of them, we want to say feature and then the number, and then we multiply it by 6. And that's it. So each of them is now called feature, and then the text in there will say feature 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so for now we don't have all the content inside of each of these features like I showed you in the demo, but just some text so that we can lay out our grid actually. So let's open our feature SASS file and start writing some code. So this features element here is a grid item, right? But now we want this grid item to also be a grid container. And so that's just the same thing as we have in Flexbox, where a flex item can easily become a flex container. So all we have to do is to write display grid, and that's it. So right now, this features element is a grid container. Now it would be really helpful and great to have something called a subgrid here. And that's actually something that's coming to CSS Grid in the second level of the specification. But right now, subgrids are not available. So what will a subgrid actually be? So basically, it will allow a grid that is inside a grid, so like in this case here, to like snap its tracks to the parent grid. For example, align its columns with the columns of the parent grid. So in this example, we could then make it so that the columns of this small grid would automatically be where the columns of our overall page layout are. Right? Does that make sense? And actually that would be really helpful here. But right now that's just not possible. And so we need to manually create new columns for this grid container. So just to show you what I mean with the subgrid, so it would be like creating a grid where we could automatically say that one column should be like these two columns here from the parent grid. Okay? So basically snapping to these tracks. But right now, again, that's not possible. And so we're just gonna manually create our grid, right? So let's start with the columns. Grid, template, columns. And remember, we want 3 columns here. And so we just say 3 columns with 1 fractional unit each. And that's it. That's 3 equally sized columns right there. Now about the rows, we don't actually need to specify anything for the rows. I mean, we could do it, and we would do it basically like this. So grid template rows, and then we could just say auto and auto, but that's not necessary at all, because that's just what's gonna happen anyway if you don't define anything at all. And so we don't need this. What actually will happen is that we create an implicit grid then, right? So all of our items will basically be placed in an implicit grid and not in an explicit grid, because we don't define the rows. So we have like 0 cells defined for our grid. But that's not a problem at all. It works just the same. So let's get rid of this, and then we're good to go. And actually, let's take a look at that so that you can see that's actually true. And here we go. So we have now future 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6 all laid out like in our demo. And we can also see that here in the DevTools quite well. So let's select this one here. And then it will deselect our overall grid, right? So we can either have this one or this one. And so down here now you see our grid, so our 3x2 grid. And you see that the line here is dotted. And as I explained to you before, that means that these are row tracks of an implicit grid. Now the next step is to actually get rid of this huge font size here and the padding that we gave this here just for testing purposes, and then get rid of the background color and also add some margin to the top and bottom of this overall parent element. Okay, so let's do that. And I'm going to put it here before the grid stuff definition. So margin, and I want 15 rem on top and on the bottom. And let's get rid of the background color as well. Then in the base, let's also delete this. And so that should look a lot more natural now. All right, so we can also add, of course, a gap here, which we haven't done yet. And let's set it to 60 pixels. So 6 rem. All right. And yeah, so that's better. And so now we're ready to start filling this up with the actual content. So what do we have here actually for the content? Let's take a look at that. And so here we see that we have like this icon here, and that comes from an SVG icon sprite that I already included in our image folder. Okay, so this time we're not going to go through manually creating that SVG sprite like we did in the last project, because right now you already know how to do that. And so I did it so that we can just use it and don't waste any time doing that, right? So we have the icon, then we have like this heading here, and then after that the paragraph with this text. Now this heading here, you see that it has this different font size than this one here, right? So remember that I said in the beginning that this font size here is like for the usual text, for the normal text, and then for the headings we have like this different font family. And these ones here are actually H4 elements. And so I decided that these smaller headings are the H4s. So this one, for example, and also this one, these are H4s. Then this one, slightly bigger, is the H3. This one here, of course, is the H1. And then we also have this one, which is the H2. Okay, so I could have done that differently, but that's just up to you how you do it in your project. So that's the hierarchy that I defined for the headings. So an SVG icon, an H4, and a paragraph with this text. So back in our index.html, let's then get rid of this text here and start including the stuff here. So we start with the icon, and remember how we did that. So use the SVG element, and we're going to call this one feature icon. And then in there, remember that we have this weird use element. So let me actually write that out. And then we use xlink href. Okay, and then image, and it's simply called sprite as before. And then in here, we have the different icons. And this one is called icon global. And so that's the one that looks like that globe. And let me actually show that to you. So image and sprite. So you cannot really see the image, but we can see the different names. So we have icon presentation or icon heart full, icon expand, icon lock, trophy, key, and so on and so forth. And you could probably open this also in some kind of a graphical software in order to take a look at these different icons here. But I'm not going to do that because I really just want to quickly get my content into here. Okay, so next we have the H4 element, and this one is called heading 4, very simply. And so you see that I'm already using like a reusable style, and so this is like a component that I'm going to reuse throughout the page later on, right? And so that's not really part of the feature block here and the feature component itself. So, world's best luxury homes. So that's the heading for the first one. And then we have, of course, the feature text. Okay, and as for this content, here in the image folder, you will see a small text file. And so in here, I have the text for these 6 elements. Okay, so let's take a look at that. And all right, we have our icon, we have our unstyled H4 and the P. So that's huge right now, but of course, we're going to take care of that later. For now, let's actually just copy this here 5 times. Replace this one here. This was just for testing purposes, but now we just have this content. And so we just have to replace then the stuff here. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think 1 is missing, yeah. And okay. So the next one is called the trophy. It says then here, only the best properties. And let's get our text. Of course, we could leave the same text here for all of these elements, but then it would look weird and not natural at all. And also I want to show you something that happens when we have different amounts of text here, okay? And so it's really useful to have it like this. Okay, next up we have to replace the global in here. Change it to map pin, and here it says all homes in top locations. And then let's get the text again. This here is key. New home in 1 week. And only 2 to go. So this one is presentation. Top 1% realtors. And finally, this one is with a lock, and it says secure payments on Nexter, so the name of the company. Let's take a look. And here we go. Okay, so that is our content ready to be styled. And we're actually going to do that right in the next lecture. This is the second part of building the features section. So this is where we left off after the last lecture, and so now it's time to actually style these icons, this heading and the paragraph, and after we're done doing that, we will then lay them out here in this way. So the icon here on this side, and then these two, one after the other. Okay, but let's start by styling these three. So we have the icon and the text and then the heading separately. So we have features and then we have the feature. So this feature component here would, in theory, be reusable in another page. So it's completely independent from the features class. But I still put them in the same file though, because they are closely related. And having these classes in different files would make me jump around a lot through the different files. And that would be terrible for recording videos like this. Okay, and so basically each of the section now got its own file. And then there I have the overall element, which is like the container of these components. But again, these feature here would be completely reusable somewhere else later on the page, or if I had another page on my website. Okay, so let's style the icon, and then let's also style the text. Okay, and actually let's start with the text. Let's set the font size to 1.7 rem, and that's it. So actually we don't have to do anything else, just increasing the font size here a bit. Then as for the icon, let's change the color, and remember how we do that with SVG icons. So what we have to do is to use the fill property, and then we use the primary color. So color primary, and so that's our golden color here again. And then finally, let's just size it. So we want a width of 45 pixels, so 4.5 rem, and then the same for the height. So that's usually the same. Okay, and now finally, we also want to style the heading 4. And that's going to be in the typography file. And so, heading 4. And we will then also later have the heading 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let me actually do all of them here. Why not? So 1, 2, 3, and then 4 here. All right. So we want them to have the font family that I mentioned before, which is this one here. Oh, sorry, now I closed it. So we want the font display. So it's Josephine Sans. And that's the one that we're going to use for all of the headings. So it is font display. And we also want the font weight to be 400. And remember, we actually included that font weight in the HTML from Google Fonts, okay? Now, we actually want all of these to have these two properties. And so that's a perfect use case for a SASS extend, right? So we can do like this placeholder that I showed you a long time ago, I think. We haven't really used it since then, but now it's a good time to use it again. So we use this placeholder, which I'm simply going to call heading. Then I put this here. And now all I have to do is to extend all of these like this. So I say extend and heading. And that's it. And so what's going to happen now is that basically this heading 1 here is copied like to this place here. So let's copy this all over the place here. And so what's going to happen now, it's like as if this heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, and heading 4 will be copied here to this selector. All right. So it's not a mixin, because the mixin works the other way around. So with the mixin, this code here would then be pasted into each of the selectors. And with an extend, it works the other way around. So basically, these selectors are copied into a huge selector, which then makes this code here apply to all of them, right? So anyway, we were talking about the heading 4, and here the font size, we want it to be 1.9 rem. Now remember that I told you that we want to use this heading 4 in different situations throughout the page. Okay, so we want to use it here on these features, but also this one here is an H4 as well. And you see that this one is white and this one is dark. And so let's actually do that with a modifier class. Okay, so let's add a modifier class, one for light, and the color here is going to be gray light 1. Okay, and then we will have dark, and that's going to be gray dark 1. And actually it's here. And so, all right, let's just duplicate this. And so this one is for dark. Now we of course have to add this here to the HTML as well. And so let's add multiple cursors here in each of them, so we don't have to write it once. So heading 4, and this one is the dark version. Okay, so the modifier is with these 2 dashes. All right, and I think that's actually it. So let's check it out in our page. And that already looks quite good, right? So this icon here has the correct size, and all of this looks just like we have it here. Okay, now all we have to do is to actually align these elements like we have it here. And how are we going to do that? Well, once again, we are going to use CSS grid here, because why not? This is just a small component, and we actually have a 2-dimensional layout here, right? So let's take a look. So this is actually 2-dimensional. So we have the row axis and the column axis. And so it's really 2-dimensional. And so why not use a CSS grid for doing that? So we will have a 2x2 grid. And let me show it to you here actually already. And that's not the one, but that's the one. So we're going to have this 2x2 grid. And then in there, we will place these 3 elements. Okay, does that make sense? So typography is done for now. And so this feature here, which itself is a grid item, of course, will now also become a grid container. And so we have a grid inside a grid inside a grid. So just like we had in Flexbox, we can really nest the grids really deep. So display grid. And let's start by defining the columns. Grid template columns. And so what width do we want to have for the first column? So the first column will contain the icon. And we already know the width of the icon, so it's 4.5 rem. And so in this column here, we could simply put 4.5 rem as well, right? But instead of doing that, we will simply put auto. Okay, or we could use min content or max content. So let's actually use min content. Why not? Because this way, if we eventually wanted to change the width here of the icon, then automatically the width of this first column would adjust without us having to change anything. And then the rest of the grid, so the second column, will simply occupy the rest. Okay, simple as that. Okay, makes sense? And now as for the rows, again, we don't really need to specify them, because all we want to happen is them to be the size of the content. And so once more, we don't really define them. And probably you start to see this emerging like as a trend. So many times we don't really define the rows, we just define the columns. And in a real world scenario, that's actually many times the case. So many times we just want the content to define the rows. And so in that case, it's not really necessary to define the rows. We will have other cases where we will define the rows, and you're going to see that later. But for now, it's good like this. It works perfectly fine like this. So let's check it out. And we'll see that it's actually not really perfect yet. Okay, so let's check out what's happening here. And so let's inspect this. And so here you see our 4 grid cells. So the first one is actually larger, much larger than the icon. And that's because right now we only have 3 elements in this grid. And so the third one, of course, because of the auto placement algorithm, gets placed here under this icon. So what we could do here is to place this grid item here in this grid cell. But actually what's even better is to make this grid cell here span all the way here until the end, so that we end up with this grid area here for this icon. Because right now this row here is also as high as this icon, but actually we just want it to be as large, as high as this text here. And so if we had all of this column here, so these 2 rows for this icon, then that would actually happen perfectly fine. So let me show that to you. So the icon, we wanted to have the grid row property set to start at number 1 all the way to the end, or span 2. So in this case, it's really the same. We could just add -1, and then we're sure that it goes all the way until the end. And so automatically now the text should get placed here to the end. And for some reason that didn't really happen. And so this is actually a good opportunity to tell you something important that I didn't tell you yet, I think. So this -1 here, this means not the end of the grid, but the end of the explicit grid, okay? And so this would be the last explicit grid line, but we didn't really define any grid rows, right? And so there's not really an explicit grid. And so this -1 here doesn't make much sense. So instead of this -1, we should simply add span 2, okay? Makes sense? So again, the -1 only works with an explicit grid, but we had an implicit grid because we didn't define the rows. And so it didn't work as expected. Right now it does, okay? And so let's inspect it here as well. So it doesn't really highlight here the spanning going on, but it doesn't matter because we can see it by ourselves, because you see that this icon here is actually already in this second cell. And so this is like all the same cell. Actually, I think if you hover it here, then you will see it. Well, not really, but again, that's not a huge problem. So we're almost done here now. What we need now is, of course, some spacing here. So add some space between the columns and the rows. And that's very simple, of course. So just add a grid row gap, and let's make it 1.5 rem. And then a gap for the column as well. So grid column gap. And this one is 2.5 rem. Okay, so let's check it out again. And all right, here we go. That looks really good already. Just a couple of things that we need to change here. So first of all, in our demo project, these icons here are actually a bit moved to the top. So basically to center the center of the icon here with the text. And that's just something that we have to do manually, okay? And so let's fix that. So we're very simply just gonna translate the icon a bit to the top. So transform and translate in the Y direction just -1 rem. Okay, and so that should fix that. Yeah, so that looks a bit more natural now. And now the second issue is that you see in these two columns where we only have 3 lines of text that this space here is huge. Okay, so I mentioned before that I wanted to have different text in the different elements, and that's because I wanted to show you how we can fix exactly this issue. So let's actually inspect it. So we want this one here now. And so you can see that this row here is larger than the row in here and in here, right? And so why is this happening? Well, it's happening because this features grid here, which contains these 6 grid items, makes it so that these grid items, that all of the grid items fill the entire grid cells, right? And so that's because of the align items property that is by default set to stretch. Remember that? So align items is the property that controls the alignment of grid items along grid cells. And so these here are the grid items of this features grid. And currently this align items property is set to stretch. So what do we do if we want all of them here to start at the top? So basically move all of this here to the top. Well, we just have to set the align items property on this parent container here to start. So let's do that. And so this here is the grid container. And so align items, let's set it to start. Okay, and if we're back now, that is how it looks like. So we could maybe even give this here like a background color, but actually that's not even necessary. Because even with this inspector here, you can see that this grid item is now no longer the exact same of the grid cell, but just the size of its content moved all the way to the top, just as we specify at the grid container. Of course, we could also set this like to end. Let me show you how that would look like. And yeah, so then it would move these 2 here, which are smaller than the other items. It would move them simply to the end, so to the bottom of their grid cell. Or we could try center also. All right, and so now it's centered, but that's still not what we want. We just want them to be at the start. Okay, And so it's really important that you are aware that all of these properties that I showed you in the first section, so in the intro section, that all of these properties exist and what they do and how you can use them to your advantage to achieve exactly what you need to achieve. Okay? And so in this case, we really needed the align items to move all of this up to the top. So up the column axis. All right. And so right now it actually looks the exact same as our demo. There's just one small thing to fix, because when you reduce this here, what you see is that it gets narrower and narrower and even more narrow. So what we want to do here, of course, is what I showed you in the last section, which is basically to make this responsive without writing a single line of media query. Okay, and so that's what happens here. So as you see, at some point, well, the text gets smaller, and that's because of media query, but that's not what I'm talking about. So what happens is that at some point, you see that it moves down here. And so instead of a 3x2 grid, we now have a 2x3. Okay, and then as it gets even smaller, it does basically a 1x6 grid. Okay, and so that's what we want to achieve, and that's quite simple actually, and even without media queries. So do you remember how we did that? Well, all we have to change here is this grid template columns and define some new column tracks. So grid template columns. So do you remember what the trick here is? Well, first of all, we need to use the autofit keyword in here. And remember what autofit does? It simply creates as many tracks as can fit based on the width that we define. Okay? And so this width that we define here will be with a min-max function. So min-max, and we say that the width should always stay between 25 rem and 1 fractional unit. And that's as simple as it. And actually I said 25. Okay, so 250 pixels basically. So again, the width of each of the tracks should always stay between 250 rem and 1 fractional unit. And based on this, CSS will add as many tracks as fit in the container. Okay, so that's exactly what we did in one of the demo examples in the last section. So let's check it out if it works. So where's the container? Okay, so we start with the 1120 pixels, and so let's move it down now. And remember that each column can have up to 250 pixels. So we start decreasing, and then bam, you see at this point it no longer could fit 3 columns, and so it reduced it to 2 columns. Okay, so let's check it out here. So you see this feature here as 251, which is almost the minimum size that it has to have. So you see, and now bam. So 250, and a bit less will push it off the edge and bring it down to 2 column tracks. Okay, so that's really amazing. That's really great and powerful. And now you see that it's even more important to use this align items set to start that I had before. For example, now here you have a lot of empty space down here, and so it's really important that you see that if we inspect this here, so the size of the item is just this, and so without the align items set to start, it would look really weird. Okay, so this works just the way I explained before, and everything is working. Of course, we could change this 250 pixels to something else, but I found that it works really well in this particular situation. Okay, and so we're actually done with this section. So we used 2 grids here, so one big grid which could fit all of these 6 items here. So one grid item for each feature, and then each feature is a grid container itself, which then itself contains these 3 grid items. So the icon, this H4, and this text. And grid allows us to nest as many grids inside of each other, and that is very helpful to create even very small 2-dimensional layouts like this one. So we could have used like Flexbox for this one here as well, but then we would have to mess like with margins. We would have added a margin to the bottom of this here, for example, or the top of the text, and that would have added some extra complexity that is not really necessary if we can use CSS Grid. Okay, so grids don't only work for the big layout parts like some people say, but they can also be for very small components, as long as they are two-dimensional. Then it makes a lot of sense using grids for that. Okay, so next up, we're going to build this part here. Okay, so yeah, stay tuned for that. Hey there, welcome back to building our project. And this time, let's build the story section. And so by building this section, you're gonna learn how to deal with overlapping grid items, why images are special and behave different than the other grid items, and also how to decide if Flexbox is a better tool than CSS Grid in certain situations. Okay, so this is the final result that we're looking for this section. And so let's start with this right side here, where we put these two headings, then the text, and finally the button. And we then, by the end, also center this vertically here in this container element. Okay, so before I already said that this one here is an H2 element, and this is an H3 element, right? And so let's now go to our markup and code up this part of the website. So we start with the story content and leave the pictures here for the next video. Okay, so we start with the heading 3. So H3, and I'm calling it heading 3. And in here it says happy customers. Then we have an H2 called heading 2. And it says the best decision of our lives. And then we also have like this special symbol here. So let me show it to you. So this one here to opening the quote, and this one to closing the quote. And so the first one is this special entity. So LD quo, and this one is RD quo. Okay. Now the paragraph, which is the story text. And so right now we're using actually the name of the block, okay? Which up here we did not, because these styles here, again, they are reusable. Then for this text, let's go back here to this file that we have and copy it, and we can also close it because we're not gonna need it ever again. So let's paste it here. And then just to finish, we need the button with the class btn. So just as we've been doing. And this one says find your own home. Okay, so let's take a look at that. And so here we go. All right, so that's what it looks like right now. And so let's first add some padding here to this box, and then start by styling the H2 and the H3, or actually the H2 and the H3. Okay. So let's open up the story file here. And we see that we already have some code here, of course, and that's because of the placement of these two grid items in our overall layout grid, right? So the content has this background color, which is actually already the one that we want in the end. And so let's just add some padding here very quickly. So 6 top and bottom, and 12 on the left and right side. Okay, let's open up the typography now. And so we're going to start styling the H2 and then the H3. So for this one, we want a font size of 4 rem, a font style of italic, and we can do that because we included the italic style here in the beginning of our HTML. So this one here, so 400i for the italic text. And then actually for this one, we also, just as for the H4, we want the light and a dark version, okay? Because we're going to reuse it somewhere else on the page with a light version. So right now here we want the dark one, so let's go add that here actually. So we want a heading 2 dark in this case, right? So that's the H2. And now as for the H3, the font size is just 1.6 rem. The color is our primary color, so the gold color. And then we also want the text to be uppercase. Okay, let's just check it out. And now here we see like a problem, and that's because of this huge line height that we defined of 1.6. And so let's put that to 1 here so that we don't have all of this space in there. So that's the H2. And so line height 1. And yeah, that looks a lot more natural. We also need some spacing here, but let's take care of that a bit later. For now, I'm going to style the button here first. And I'm also going to do that in the typography here, actually. So down here, let me just add a button class here. So the background color is again the primary color. The text color should then be white. And since it is a button element, we need to also get rid of the border. So border none, and also of the border radius. Because by default it has some, and we don't need that. Okay. So as for the font family, it should be also the display font. So font display. The font size should be 1.5 rem, and we want it to be transformed to uppercase. So this is nothing new here, maybe just to get some practice for you. Maybe for that it's good. Okay. Then also let's add some padding, 1.8 to top and bottom, and 3 left and right. And again, I played around with these values, and these are the ones that I like the most. Okay, so if you want to take a look at different values, of course you can do that. So we also defined a pointer as a cursor, because otherwise the button doesn't have like this hand cursor. Now we also want a small and subtle hover effect. So nothing crazy here in this case. And all that's going to change is just the background color to color primary and the dark version. Okay, then some transition here, of course. And again, nothing all too crazy. So let's check that one out. And yeah, well, the transition doesn't look right. Now that's because I'm missing the second here. All right. Yeah, so that looks a lot better. So now let's just quickly style this text, and it should look like this. So of course bigger and also italic. So where do we do that? Well, right here in the story, and we can do it then down here, because remember it's called story text. Okay. So font size 1.5 rem, and the font style should be italic. Okay, that's better also. Now about the spacing that I was mentioning, we really shouldn't hard code the margin bottoms here into these headings, because again, we're going to reuse them throughout the page. And so if we add some margin here that's good for these situations, then that margin might not be good for other situations in other places of our page. And so just like we did with other projects in this course, we're going to use some helper classes here. Okay, so I'm actually going to add them here also in the typography file, because I don't want to just create another file just for this. Okay, so right now I'm being a bit lazy here for that, but it's no problem. Okay, if you have a bigger project, then of course you cannot do it like this, but I'm just going to put some margin bottom classes here, and so it's no big deal. So I'm simply going to call these MB, which stands for margin bottom, and then SM, which stands for small. Okay, so that we don't have to write out like these huge class names. So margin bottom, and let's set this one to just 2 rem. Okay, and so we're gonna use that one for the first heading. Then let's simply copy this and paste it a couple of times. So small, medium, large, and huge. So 2, 3, and I'm not sure if I'm gonna use the other ones here as well, but let's just fill them out. Okay, we always have to assume that our project might grow sometime in the future, and we have to be prepared for that. And so these helper classes, they are very useful for that. And in fact, there is something happening in CSS right now where people are starting to like style their entire pages using only these small and unique classes. That's called atomic CSS, And if you want to look into that, it's also quite interesting. I'm not sure if I'm a big fan of that right now, but I can definitely see how it's useful to use these classes here in some points, okay? So sometimes it's really useful. Maybe it's a bit too much to style all of the elements on your page just using these helper classes like some people are doing, but definitely they have a place in CSS development, okay? And so right now, let me go ahead and actually use them, okay? So the first one here, I wanted to have a margin bottom of small, and this one, a margin bottom of medium. And let me take a look. So this one is 4 rem here. So let's actually use this one here for the paragraph. Okay, so margin bottom and large. Or I could actually put these 4 rem margin bottom directly on this element here, right? Because it's not a reusable one. So let me come here to the story text and simply add a margin bottom of 4 rem here in this case. Okay, so instead of using a helper class here, it's not really necessary because it is not a reusable element that I want to reuse somewhere else on the page. Okay, and so yeah, that's what it looked like, and the spacing looks good like this. And so we're ready to move on to the next step, which is to actually vertically center all of this here in this parent container. Now, how are we actually gonna do that? Well, we could, of course, use CSS grid once more, and it wouldn't be all too difficult to do that. However, this is just a one-dimensional layout, in fact, right? So you have this element here, then this, and then this, all after another. But on the sides, you don't have anything else. And so it's just a one-dimensional layout, like it's going in this direction from here to here. So we could use, instead of CSS grid, Flexbox here, right? And remember that I said that in modern web development, CSS grid is sometimes, or actually many times, used together with Flexbox. And in this case, Flexbox is clearly a good solution to do exactly what we want to do here. Okay? And so you can also practice some Flexbox here, and so that's a great opportunity as well. So how are we going to do that? Well, first of all, we need to say that this content here, which is the parent element, should be the Flex container, right? So display Flex, and so let's take a look at what happens here. And of course, I hope that's what you expected. Okay, so all of these Flex items are now side by side. But that's not what we want, right? We want them one below the other. And so we need to change the Flex direction to column. Okay, and so with that, remember we also changed the axis. So this is now the main axis going from the top down, and the cross axis is now going from the left to the right. Okay, so how do we now center all of these items here across the main axis? So this axis here. How do we do that? Well, we simply use justify content. Set it to center, and that's actually it. So yeah, that's it. So you see, when we now change the size of this, you see that it always stays here nicely vertically centered, right? There's just one small problem with that, and that is that this button here is now ranging all the way from this side to the other side. And do you remember why that is happening? It is because the align items property in Flexbox is set to stretch. Okay, so align items aligns the items along the cross axis in Flexbox. So in this direction here, it is set to stretch, but we don't want that. Instead, we want it to set to Flex start. So let's do that. Flex start, let's check it out. And that's it. So that is the solution of this problem. So I know that maybe it's a bit confusing for you to now use Flexbox all together here with CSS grids, but that's just so that you know that this is how it works in the real world, and also that you don't forget Flexbox just because you'll know CSS grid now. Okay, so of course we could have done it with CSS grid as well, and so let me show that to you as well. And actually it would have been even easier than this. So let's take this part out of the code. And so instead of a Flexbox container, let's set it to grid now. And so now which property do we actually use to align all of our grid tracks in the vertical direction? That's the align content property. and we just have to set it to center. Okay, so let's take a look at that. And yeah, it works just the same. So let's actually inspect this here. So story content. And so these are the grid items here, of course, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they are now vertically centered as well because of this align content set to center. Okay, now the same thing here happens as we had before with the flexbox, which is that this here now spans all the way across this grid track. And that is once more because the grid items by default stretch all across their grid cells. Okay, so how do we stop them from doing that and instead put them here just all the way to the start, so to the left side? Well, we're looking at the row axis here, right? And to align the items in the row axis, we use justify items. Okay, remember that? So justify items start, and that should fix it. And indeed, it does. So everything works just the same as with the flexbox solution. Okay, it's just that we're now using CSS grid here for a one-dimensional layout, and that's, I think, a bit weird. So it's a bit counterintuitive because for that we have flexbox. But of course, it's not a problem at all, and so I'm actually going to leave it as it is. And we have instead of 4 lines of CSS, we have only 3. So we actually even have to write a bit less code. Okay, so you can go whatever makes more sense to you. But it's also good to see that we can use these two different technologies to achieve the exact same thing. Okay. Now another thing that I just noticed when I was resizing this page here is that at some point there's not enough space here, and we have a bit too much space here on the left and on the right side. And so we can also, instead of having it hard-coded like this here, so the left and right paddings, they're hard-coded to being 12 rem. We can also set them as a percentage of the viewport. Okay, and so let's go like with 10 viewport width units, and let's see if that changes it. Oh, and that's actually a bit too much. Let's move it down to like 8, and that looks much better. And so if we resize it now, that's much nicer. Okay, so you see that now this padding really changes as the width of the container here, of the viewport changes, right? So that's a bit more natural. And yeah, so this viewport width unit is getting more and more used for building these really truly responsive layouts. And it's actually an amazing unit. It's really helpful for this kind of stuff. And I hope you can see that and you can use it more and more in your designs whenever you see fit. So this first part here of the stories is now done. Next up, we're going to then place these 2 images here. And for that, again, we're going to use CSS grid. So right in the next video is where we're going to do that. This is the second part of building the story section. So let's continue. And again, this is how it looks like. So we have like this background image here in the back, of course. And then we have these 2 images here. This one here kind of in the center with this couple here that supposedly just built a new house for themselves, which is this one. And so this one is on top, and it actually also overlaps a bit this part of the section and goes all the way in this here. And I think this creates kind of a modern and catchy look. Okay, so that's why I went for that. So how are we going to do this? Well, we're just going to create a huge grid, basically occupying this entire area here. And then we're going to just position these 2 images on there. We could do this in many different ways. I choose to just do it like this because, again, this is a grid course. And so that's what I'm going to do here, using CSS grids. So first the markup, which is just very simple. So img, and the class is simply story img, and this one is number 1. And the source is image and story1, and the alternative text is just couple with new house, let's say. And then let me just copy this, story2, and yeah, let's just say that this is the new house and change this one to number 2 as well. Okay, and that is it. So let's now go ahead to our story file. So this one is the pictures part. So the container of these images is the pictures. And so let's now turn this into a grid container. So display grid. And let's also set the styles for the images. So it's called image 1, and image 2. So let's set both of them for now to width 100%. Okay, so this is kind of what we always do. We always should specify a width in percentages for images so that they say flexible. Right, we're then going to change this here maybe a bit later, but for now that's good. So let's take a look at that. And so right now, of course, they occupy the entire container. So the container is this one here, and so they occupy 100% of that. But that is of course not the result that we want to see in the end. So again, let's create a grid here and then position these items in there. So, and what I want to do is to create a 6x6 grid. And let me show you why here in the final example. So with 6x6, basically this space here is one column, this space here is another column, and then this one here is the other 4 columns. And so with this, basically we have 4/6 of the container as the image, and the other 2/6, so 1/3, as the remaining space, right? So basically 66% of this container will be the image, and then 33% will be the remaining space. So 16.7% here on each side, on this side and on this side. Okay, we could have done it completely different way, but I wanted it to be like this. I wanted 2/3 of the width of this to be the image. Okay, and so a 6x6 container, because the same thing then can apply to the rows as well. Okay, so very simple. Grid template rows. Repeat 6 1 FR. So again, we use 1 FR to create equally sized tracks. So rows in this case and columns in this case. Okay, so let's take a look at that just so that we know where we want to actually position them. Oh, and you see that now already these images are occupying one grid cell and no longer the entire parent container. So where is that? Yeah, it's this one here. So you see it's a 6x6 grid, and each of these images is now in one of the grid cells occupying 100% of the width. Okay, so now what do we want to do with this image here? We wanted to start here at line number 2 and going all the way to line number 6. And for the rows, we want the same. So going from number 2 to number 6. Okay, so let's do that. So grid row from 2 to 6, or we could use span 4, but let's just do it like this. And then grid column, the same, 2 and 6. So let's now take a look at the result, and it looks like this. And now what you see here is kind of a weird behavior, right? And that's because this grid item here doesn't really fit the grid area, okay? And that is because it is an image. So regular grid items, like if this was just a div, it would fill up its entire grid area, right? So this entire area here that we defined, but not images. And that's because images are different in a sense that they have an intrinsic aspect ratio associated with them. So meaning that it has some dimensions and therefore also an aspect ratio. And what happens is that the image always tries to keep that aspect ratio, even if we tell it that it should fill up this entire grid area here. Okay, so it doesn't really do that. Instead, it keeps its aspect ratio. Now, if we want this to be truly here in the center, then we can simply set the align items property to center, right? That's because, remember, the align items property aligns grid items to their grid cells in the column axis. So if we do that, here on the container, of course, align items, set to center, and then it is centered in its grid area, okay? So once more, these properties like align and justify, they're really useful and helpful to know them in situations like this. And you see that also it already happened up here. So this small image here is now also centered vertically inside of its grid cell. So next up is then this image here. And we want it to be like kind of here in the center of this. So starting like here from this middle point of the grid and then expanding all the way to this side. So we're going to go from column number 4, so number 4 to 7, and then from the row we go from line number 4 to line number 6. All right, so image number 2, grid row, we go from 4 to 6, and then for the column from 4 to 7, I believe. And so let's check that one out. And yeah, that's right. Okay, now here in this situation, this actually overlaps it a little bit, right? And how do we achieve that? Well, it's actually quite simple, and we could do it in 2 ways. We could use a transform and simply scale it up a little bit, but then it wouldn't really start here in the middle anymore, unless we then also defined the transform origin, but that's a bit too much, I believe. And so let's simply change the width of the image. So if we change this width to 115 or something a bit bigger or smaller, but I found that this one works really well. If we change it to this, well, then it's just going to increase to this side. And now we cannot really see it, but if I inspect it, then you will see that it actually moved to that side, okay? And so why can we now not see it? Well, it's just because of the z-index. So we have to assign it a bigger z-index. Any number really works here. Let's just use something big, so something like 20, and then we should be good to go. And indeed, now it is on top of this other element here on the side. All right, so looking good already. Now let's just add a couple of shadows here to these images. So box shadow 0 to rem, then 5 rem of blur, and then an RGBA of black with just 0.1. And then the same here for the image number 2, and this one with 0.2. Okay, because this one here is actually overlapping this lighter area, and so otherwise we will not see it at all. Okay, and now all we have to do is just this background area here, which I wanted to do at the beginning, but I just forgot about it. So let's do that now. So it is here in this pictures container, of course. So it's just background image, URL, and then we have to move up 1 level, right? Because once this is compiled, we are in the CSS folder, and from there we need to move up in the global project folder, and then from there we go into IMG, and then this one is called simply back.jpg. Now this is actually not all, because this is just the image like this, but we have this overlay here in order to make it fit better into the overall look and color scheme of our page, right? So like this, it looks a bit out of place, you know, and so we need some overlay with some color in order to make it look a bit more in place. So for that, we just use the linear gradient trick, where we then use a color, and in this case our primary color, and give it some off value here to make it 50% transparent. Okay, so this trick here with the linear gradient is to give it 2 equal colors. So basically the gradient goes from one color to the other color, and so that is one background image on top, and then after that, below it basically, we have then the image. Okay, and so that should work now, and indeed here it is. So I hope that made sense here with the positioning of the elements into this grid. Of course, I could have had used absolute positioning to position these images, but I just wanted to do it like this to use a grid once more for this purpose. And I think we created quite a nice look here. All right, and so we're really finished here with this. And next up, we're gonna tackle this next homes section here. Okay, so create these beautifully designed cards. So let's move on now. Hello there! It's great to see that you're still with me here building this project. And so in this lecture and the next one, we will build a section which contains the available homes on the website. And I'm actually really excited for this one because now you're going to learn how to build a rather complex component using a mix of CSS grid properties, overlapping, and flexbox. And so basically what we're going to do here in this section is to lay out these cards here, okay? So each of these homes gets its own card. And I actually love to design these cards. So we had a card in the Neighbors project, if you remember that one. And now we have these cards here. So one card for each home. And so of course, all of this here, all of these elements that you see here, they are laid out using CSS grid. Then also the 6 cards that we have here, they are also laid out in a grid, okay? So let's actually start with that overall grid, which is a 3x2 grid, such as we had before in the features section. And then after that, we will start building. So let's go to our markup here, of course, and create 6 home elements. So home, and I'm once more going to use emit here, which I showed you in the features section. And so I use the curly brackets to add some content into each of these elements. So let's just say home card, and then the number of the element times 6, because we want 6, hit tab, and that's it. And so now we can open up our file here, so the homes file, and start building our grid. So of course, our grid container here is this homes element, which is the parent of our 6 home grid items. So let's define our grid columns here. And let's do that the exact same way that we did in the features section, okay? So we're going to use repeat, and we say that we want as many columns as fit into the grid container. And for that, remember, you can use the autofit keyword. Okay, and then we say that we want each of these columns to have at least 25 rem and that they can go all the way to 1 fractional unit. So we do that with min-max, as we did many times before, and we say the minimum to 25 rem, meaning 250 pixels, and going all the way to 1 fractional unit if there is enough space available for that. So again, this is what we did with the features section, and this will ensure that basically these columns are completely responsive without having to write a media query at all. Now let's also define the gap between the rows and the columns at the same time of 70 pixels. Okay, and then just for the home, let's define a quick background color here, just so that we can see if our grid is working correctly. So background color, and I'm gonna use color gray light 1. Okay, so this one here, and that's actually the real background color that these cards will have. So let's check that out now. And for some reason that's not quite working yet. And yeah, so that's because I keep forgetting to set the display property to grid. So display grid. And also let's add some margin here, such as in the features section. So 15 rem top and bottom, and 0 on these sides. Okay, and so now that should look better. And yeah, now what's this weird background color? Now I think that's, yeah, we left that here. So of course we need to get rid of that. And all right, so here we have our 6 home cards basically. Now all we have to do is to fill them and then of course style them, which is going to be the toughest part. So let's start with the content in the HTML. Okay, so we don't want any of this. Let's give us some space here. And so what do we actually have in each of these home cards? Well, let's actually go back and check it out. That's the easiest way. So we have the image here, which shows the home. Then we have this heart button here, which is basically so that the user can click this and then put it on the wish list. So saying that he likes this property. Then we have, of course, the name of the property, the location, how many rooms it has, the area, the price, and then down here we have this button where we can then click and contact a realtor. Okay, So again, image, then this heart icon here, then we have the name of the house, then these 4 details, and then finally a button. So let's put all of that here into our component.